Okay, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to our sponsors on campus, the History Club and Phi Alpha Theta, the History Department, the Intellectual Life Fund, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the College of Extended Learning, the College of Business and Public Administration, Pfau Library, and the University Diversity Committee. And thanks, of course, to Professor Perry Link for coming today, who is the Chancellorial Chair for Teaching Across Disciplines and Distinguished Professor of Comparative Literature and Foreign Languages at the University of California, Riverside. Professor Link has a BA in Philosophy, an MA in East Asian Studies, and a PhD in Chinese History from Harvard University, and has taught Chinese language and literature at Princeton University from 1973 to 77 and 89 to 2008. And in the interim, he taught at UCLA from 1977 to 1988. He's published in the fields of modern Chinese language, literature, popular culture, intellectual history, art, and politics. And among his many books are An Anatomy of Chinese, Rhythm, Metaphor, and Politics. And also he's co-editor of Liu Xiaobo's book, No Enemies, No Hatred. And these are both here available for you guys to purchase. I can't think of anybody better to be here today to tell us about Liu Xiaobo, to talk about China today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Perry Link.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be here. I've driven by your lovely campus several times to go to the mountains or go skiing or points north, but I've never seen this lovely campus, and I'm so charmed to be able to look out at the scenery on the other end and feel sorry for you folks who have to look at me and that instead. Jeremy warned me about the wind today. He said, hold on to your hat, and I said, never mind my hat. As long as it doesn't blow my remaining hair off, I'm all right. So far, that hasn't happened. I'm going to talk today about, essentially this book. Liu Xiaobo is, of course, he's in prison now. He's serving an 11-year sentence, and he's about halfway through it. And 5 years ago, even, I always thought of him as sort of a gadfly, somebody who nipped at the government, and but not until he did his Charter 08, which I helped to translate in the fall of 08. And then he was given his prison sentence and then won the Nobel Prize. And Harvard University Press called me up and said, would I edit this book? And I said yes, and I started to read deeper and deeper and deeper. Only then did I really appreciate he's much more than a gadfly. He really is very erudite. He reads broadly, both in Chinese history and in Western history and literature. He has poems about Immanuel Kant and essays about Confucius and his contemporaries. So that's why I think this is a good book. And it also shows why he really does deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. He's that caliber of an intellectual. I want to start by reading 2 paragraphs from my own introduction to this book, because it says more tersely than what I might say otherwise. Liu Xiaobo is one of those unusual people who can look at human life from the broadest of perspectives and reason about it from first principles. His keen intellect notices things that others also look at, but somehow do not see. It seems that hardly any topic in Chinese culture, politics, or society evades his interest, and he can write with analytic calm about upsetting things. One might expect such calm in a recluse, a hermit poet, or a cloistered scholar, but in Liu Xiaobo it comes in an activist. Repeatedly, he has gone where he thinks he should go and done what he thinks he should do, as if immune to things like havoc, danger, and the possibility of prison. He seems to move through life taking mental notes on what he sees, hears, and reads, as well as on the inward responses that he feels. Luckily for us, his readers, he also has a habit of writing free from fear. Most Chinese writers today, including many of the best ones, write with political caution in the backs of their minds and with a shadow hovering over their fingers as they pass over the keyboard. How should I couch things? What topics should I not touch? What indirection should I use? Liu Xiaobo does none of this. With him, it's all there. What he thinks, you get. I want to do three things in this little talk. One is to give a very galloping kind of capsule overview of how Liu Xiaobo sees China. These are my words summarizing his view. Then I want to give you just a little capsule of his life and what happened to him. And then finally, if we have time, introduce some of the individual essays in the book. His view is that the communist movement came out not of Marxism and Leninism in European tradition, but out of Chinese rebellion ideology tradition. Things like the White Lotus Rebellion in the late 18th century and the Taiping Revolution in the mid-19th, where you have a millenarian leader who promises a heaven on earth and has a very hierarchical structure that's very, very secretive, but goes along with an egalitarian ideology. All of these features of the communist movement under Mao are visible in pre-modern Chinese peasant rebellions. That's where it comes from, not much from Marxism, which is a sort of a papier-mâché sort of covering over it all, and has, by the way, deceived a lot of Westerners who like to take that seriously, including me when I was a grad student, by the way. I started out as a student rebel, protesting the Vietnam War and stuff like that. Mao's thinking is less orthodox communist than it is Mao power, China power, taking over all of China and dominating, and ideally, in Mao's original view, dominating part of the world, if not all of the world. Mao's doctor's memoirs are very illuminating on that kind of point. Then when he gets to actually ruling, Mr. Mao, in the 50s, there's a bifurcation of language and thought, because you've got this ideology of serve the people and so on that is attractive, and a lot of people threw themselves into it idealistically. But then, when you get an anti-rightist campaign and a great leap forward that induces a huge famine, people are shocked into seeing that the theory with all of that nice language and the practice of what actually happens on the ground are two different levels. And yet you need to accommodate both levels. What's on the ground is on the ground. That's your daily life. But that official language is still there. And to get through life, you have to pretend that you take it seriously. You sort of play it like a chess game in order to get what you want. So you've got this bifurcation of language. Then you get the Great Famine. You students of China, you know about 30 million people, give or take 10 million, died in a human-caused famine in the late 1950s and early 60s. The Great Cultural Revolution, which just about, what word to use here? What word, Jeremy? Undermines and causes to collapse not only society, but a lot of the values in society on which this society is based. Presses, finally, to a point by the mid-70s where even Mr. Mao sort of realizes this didn't work. My back is to the wall. That's when he reaches out to Nixon and Kissinger and then finally tries something else. Then he dies in 1976. Deng Xiaoping comes in and pushes much faster in that other direction. But when we get to Deng Xiaoping and the big reform movement that started in the late 70s and goes arguably until the present day, Liu Xiaobo and people like him interpret Deng Xiaoping, the leader's role, not as the architect of the movement from the top down. but as reacting to popular demands that come from below. Because Mr. Mao had pushed the society to an extreme, there's this bounce back. And in the late 70s already, even before Mao died, farmers in Anhui started to say, we're not going to obey this commune system that you've put on us anymore. We're going to have our own plots and take responsibility for them. In the late 70s, the intellectuals had their democracy wall that Deng Xiaoping tolerated for a while because it helped to turn the corner from the Mao regime to his own, but then squelched rather quickly. But my point here is that it was a bottom-up demand. And then through the 80s, there were several student movements that brought up reform and pushed reform, but always from below, from below. So Deng Xiaoping was not wanting all of these liberalizations to happen. He was handling them because people from below demanded them. This is my personal view, but also Liu Xiaobo's. In fact, the reason it's my view, in part, is because he's convinced me of these things. Then we get to, of course, the massacre in 1989, and since then, the boom in the Chinese economy, which everyone admires. And of course, the average wealth of Chinese people, on average, has gone up. But as it's gone up, the rich have gotten richer much, much faster than the poor have gotten richer. So the gap has grown immensely. You all know that in our society, this is a problem. The wealthy are getting wealthier faster than everybody else. In China, that's true too, but even more. The so-called Gini coefficient that economists use to measure economic inequality is considerably higher in China even than it is in our country, and it's going up in our country. Because you have this huge pool of frustrated people who during the Mao era were in their work units and in their communes, and in those days you couldn't even buy a bicycle or certain commodities of food without having permission from your party secretary or ration coupons. You couldn't get married, you couldn't travel without permission. Then, with reform, more and more and more, you can do these things. And when the massacre came in '89, Deng Xiaoping was faced with the question of how can we recoup a sense of legitimacy in the view of our own people after almost everybody, certainly everybody in the cities, knew that we used tanks and machine guns to shoot down students. It's hard to say socialist values are still going to work anymore because that bifurcation of language has now collapsed and people are cynical about the official level. He turned to nationalism and to money making. And all of these people who for years were in their work units and repressed were told, you still can't do independent thinking politically or in religion or in the whole realm that's called thought, but economics, yes, go for it. And so they did. And people went from the countryside to the coasts to work in sweatshops and build things that we buy at Walmart and had a higher standard of living, yes. And the economy boomed, yes. But the difference between the rich and the poor boomed as well. So that now virtually everyone in the super elite is super wealthy. Every now and then the New York Times or Bloomberg News does a new expose of, including the current top leader, Xi Jinping's family is fabulously wealthy. Zhou Yongkang, the man that he's just attacked, is fabulously wealthy. Li Peng's family is probably wealthiest of all of them. Wen Jiabao, the liberal-minded one in the previous regime, was exposed too. So that's not a miracle. That happened because people who are frustrated and repressed and are given the one avenue in which they can gallop forward, economics, do it, and they do it 7 days a week often, with no protection from a free press, no independent unions, no independent courts if they have a problem. So is it a miracle? No, it's not a miracle. Of course that happened. It will, I think, eventually come to an end. Already Chinese labor prices are getting higher than available alternatives like Vietnam or North Korea if they ever pull the wall down and stuff. But be that as it may, that's Liu Xiaobo's basic interpretation of the economic boom. That it's created by the hardworking people at the bottom, not by the maestros at the top because they have some kind of special economic secret. Now, what does he do about all this? One of the essays in the book, and one of the ones for which he was sent to prison, is called "To Change a Regime by Changing Society," where he's very realistic in a sense. First of all, he uses this radioactive term, regime change. No wonder they wanted to put him in prison. But he doesn't see any political force on the horizon that's going to do it. As soon as you get any kind of an organization going in China that the party doesn't control, it's squelched. And there doesn't seem to be a Gorbachev type or a Jiang Jingguo type in Taiwan. You know about the son of the Taiwan dictator Jiang Jieshi, who then sort of decided democracy's better and ushered in democracy in Taiwan quite successfully. But Liu Xiaobo says, I don't see that kind of figure in China, and it's very hard to organize any kind of a political movement. There is no political force that's remotely as powerful as the Communist Party of China. So where is the hope? And then the second part of the essay is about where the hope is. It's bottom up. It's each of us learn to be a human being and insist on being humane in our own context. We treat each other as human beings, not as slots in this machine. And we keep going and we push, and every now and then we'll be pushed back, yes. But as soon as we're pushed back, then more space eventually opens up to march forward. And he gives examples about how if you go slowly and you retreat when you're attacked, but then you keep going, it is making slow progress. And it is. I mean, in a minute I'm going to talk about the internet, and you'll see how that pushing forward happens. But now I want to go to part 2 of what I planned to do today and give you a capsule of his life. He was born in 1955 in the Northeast in the city of Changchun. He was 11 years old when the schools closed. Schools closed all over China in 1966 because that was the onset of the Cultural Revolution. But he writes that in a sense was good for him because when he couldn't go to school, it allowed him the freedom to go read what he could find on his own and to escape what he calls the mind-closing processes of Maoist education. And most importantly, taught him to think for himself. If there's no longer a teacher or a textbook telling me what to think, I read the books and I think for myself. And by the way, it's not just him. A lot of Chinese intellectuals from that generation had that kind of experience where the Cultural Revolution, ironically, was a door opener for them because it taught them that valuable lesson that you need to think for yourself. After Mao died, the universities opened. He went to college at Jilin Daxue, Jilin University in the Northeast, and studied Chinese literature. 4 years later, he went to Beijing Normal University for graduate study and finished in 1988 with a dissertation on aesthetics and human freedom, which was a plea for liberation of the human spirit through art. He was already teaching and was a very popular teacher, so his university that gave him the PhD kept him on as a lecturer. That's a high honor in China. Most people don't get that honor. He became known all through the 80s as a grad student and a young lecturer as the Heima, the black horse of the Chinese literary scene, because he criticized almost everybody, the Maoist writers and the semi-Maoist writers and the ones that guarded their words and even the ones who spoke out against the regime, like Liu Binian, the famous journalist. He said Liu Binian still has too much of a sense that if only the top leader, like Hu Yaobang, could take over, things would be good. And anyway, Liu Xiaobo criticized everybody in style. He is a kind of a spunky, this is where my idea spunky came from, character. In 1986, he wrote, "I can sum up what's wrong with Chinese writers in one sentence. they can't write creatively themselves. They simply don't have the ability because their very lives don't belong to them. In 1989, he had made a major turning point. He stopped being so aggressive in his attack on his fellow writers, softened in a couple of senses, and changed directions. Two things happened to him in 1989 that caused this. One is that he went abroad. He went to Europe and then to the US in 1988 and 89. And he was disillusioned by the West in certain ways. Before then, inside China, he'd always said, oh, the West has got it right, and here we have to do this and this to measure up to a democratic system and a free market system and a this and a that and human rights and everything. And when he went to Oslo, where later he was given the Nobel Prize, even though he couldn't be there, he went to a conference on modern Chinese film and said that it was agonizingly boring. The sinologists there, the China scholars, disappointed him because most of them couldn't speak Chinese. They could only read it. And they were far too gullible in simply accepting what the Chinese government said was the truth about the society, and concluded that, this is a direct quote, they're 98% useless. Right? He's saying this to his hosts. Right? Still spunky. He went then to New York, to Columbia University, where he learned more deeply about Western civilization and was reinforced in the feeling that Western culture and society is not the panacea, or not the perfect model anyway, flawed in its own way. He noticed the energy crisis, the environmental imbalance, nuclear problems, and what he called the addiction to pleasure and to commercialization. He went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and was smitten almost in a transcendental sense by this sense that the individual person is incomplete. And not quite religious, but in that direction, and criticizing himself and other Chinese writers for not having this sense of transcendental mystery. But while he was doing that, sort of opening his eyes to a wider perspective, the whole democracy movement in Beijing started to happen in April of 1989. He was at Columbia University at the time. And he watched it unfold, and most people in Beijing who saw the danger coming were fleeing away from Beijing. He decided he was going to flee toward Beijing. He got on a plane in late April and flew to Beijing and joined the hunger-striking students and worked with them and wrote a June 2nd hunger strike declaration, saying along the way that, this is a quote, "I hope that I'm not the type of person who, standing at the doorway to hell, strikes a heroic pose and then starts frowning with indecision." So he goes to Tiananmen, where the students are. At that point, by early June, martial law has been declared, and there's tanks and machine guns on the outsides of the city, and it was really a tense situation. Nobody quite knew what would happen. And this hunger strike declaration, which is in the book, by the way, there's a bunch of documents in the back of the book, and this is one of them. "We must begin to build democracy in China in a spirit of tolerance and with conscious cooperation. A democratic society is not built on hatred and enmity." That's where this title of the Harvard book comes from. But it's built on consultation, debate, and voting that are carried out on a basis of mutual respect, tolerance, and willingness to compromise. Now, he showed this willingness to compromise just about 24 hours later, because when the troops came in on the night of June 3rd, he was still at the heart of the square with the die-hard students, and there are quite a few in the square still. And he negotiated with the army to try to avoid a violent confrontation in Tiananmen Square. And it worked. He eventually, well, not just he, there were 3 or 4 of them that worked on this, led the students out of the square in the southeast corner of the square. And there weren't any massacres of the students right in the square. There were some very bloody massacres on the way to the square, down the Chang'an Boulevard. By the way, the party leadership to this day in China likes to say, it's a myth that there was a Tiananmen massacre because nobody was killed in the square. That's probably not literally true. There are eyewitnesses to people who were shot in the square, but in a large sense it is true because most of the massacre didn't happen in the square. It happened on the way. Anyway, Liu Xiaobo did that compromise to save the ones that were still in the square. It's impossible to say exactly how many lives, but there you go. Then he went to the foreign diplomatic quarter and took refuge there with some friends, and later felt terribly, terribly guilty at having done that. Because when the tanks came in and were shooting other people, before and after he retreated, others were running out on the street, pulling people away, trying to save them, and sometimes risking or losing their own lives in trying to help others while he was sitting in the diplomatic quarter safe. And partly for that personal guilt feeling, and partly just because of the horror of the massacre, this image of the ghosts of Tiananmen, the lost souls, hovers over him and comes out in his writing ever since from time to time. In particular, every year on the anniversary of the massacre, he writes a poem. He's been in prison out of touch with the outside world for the last few years, so I can't promise you that he's written them recently, but I'm confident that he has, because he's made a point of every year doing it. I'm going to read you just one part of the poem that he wrote on the 10th anniversary, which is called Standing in the Execrations of Time. And this is just the first 1/8 of the poem or so. To me, standing amid the execrations of time, that day seems so strange. 10 years ago, this day, dawn, a bloody shirt. Sun, a torn calendar. All eyes upon this single page. The world, a single outraged stare. Time tolerates no naivete. The dead rage and howl till Earth's throat grows hoarse. Gripping the prison bars, he wrote this when he was in a labor camp in the Northeast. Gripping the prison bars, this moment, I must wail in grief, for I fear the next, so much I have no tears for it. Remembering them, the innocent dead, I must thrust a dagger calmly into my eyes, must purchase with blindness a clarity of the brain, for that bone-devouring memory is best expressed by refusal. And it goes on and on. Now, for his efforts at Tiananmen, he himself was labeled as a black hand behind the movement, and which was called a counter-revolutionary riot. And on June 6th, just 2 days after the massacre, he was sent to prison in Beijing at a very comfortable, high-level prison. This is the prison they use for respected guests. Mrs. Mao, when she was retired, was arrested, was sent there, and held just over 18 months. Not mistreated. It was a comfortable prison. He wrote that he was deathly bored, but that's about it. Then he was released, but went back to his university and had lost his job. They wouldn't take him back. So he didn't have any means to support himself except to write political essays, but of course he couldn't publish them inside China. He sent them to Hong Kong mostly, and some to New York, and had them published and got enough gaofei, enough manuscript fees to get by on. And a lot of those are what's in this book. Essays that he wrote from the early 1990s up until when he was arrested in 2008. Since then, we don't have his stuff because he's been in prison again. So in the third part of what I want to say today, I'll try to keep this under an hour, is just to introduce some of these essays. I told you a moment ago that I'd talk about the internet, and he's got 2 or 3 essays on the internet, which in one of them he calls God's gift to the Chinese people. A moment ago, what I mentioned about the internet is that it allows people to organize without being physically organized. This is what I was saying before, and it's true then and it's true after the internet, that if you're physically organized, if you have a meeting like us here, and we're going to go do something downtown San Bernardino and stuff, the police will come in and disband us. You can't do it. And when things are tight, such as at the Tiananmen demonstration, sometimes the walls of the university were closed and the gates locked, so students are physically confined. So this problem of physically presenting organization was a major tool that the party used in keeping dissent down. But with the internet, I'm sure you guys all know, you're internet users, more than I am, I'm too old. Everybody can be at his or her own machine, right? And yet you're organized. You can do a petition, you can exchange views, you can edit a manuscript. He's got an essay in the book where he compares what it's like to do a protest petition in the mid-90s with the mid-2000s, just 10 years later. In the mid-90s, he had to draft something and then hop on his bicycle and ride to 10 different friends and say, what do you think of this? And should we change this word and that? And then when he's all done, he has to worry about, did that change meet with what that person thought? And go back and check again, get on his bicycle again. Finally, he gets the petition done. And then you have to sort of do the whole thing again to gather signatures. You carry it all around and you gather signatures. Wow, when the internet comes, all of that's different. I get on here, I draft something, boop, send it to my friends, they edit, boop, send it back, and then when it's all done, put it online and you can sign. Of course, the internet police come in and try to block you and stuff, but the process of doing the organizing is much, much easier, so that there becomes something that he calls cyber assembly. Not physical assembly that the police can knock apart, but cyber assembly. Another major contribution of the internet is that it improves the news that people get. It's the first medium in the history of the Communist Party of China's control of the media that it hasn't been able to keep entirely under the rug. First, of course, there were newspapers, and then radio, and bulletin boards, and television, one by one, and books, magazines. They all can have editorial boards that are intimidated and have to watch their words and then are double-checked before anything goes out. The internet, starting in the early 2000s, was too flexible and too lively to control that way. So, when something happens in society, people will get on the internet and say, what happened? And now with smartphones, and there's about 900 million smartphones in China today, smartphones can take a photo of what's happening and put it on the internet. A couple of years ago, I was at a place in Asia, I'm not allowed to say where it was, but it was a workshop for activists sponsored by the UN, activists in how to do citizen activism inside China. And there was a specific workshop topic on how to use a cell phone to intimidate the police. They're going to come in and do something illegal. The letter of the law is there. You still have to play the language game of pretending that you obey the law. So you use your cell phone and you take the photo, and if you have to back up, this is how you do it, or you put it down and your friend over there does it instead of you. They had this whole workshop on how to do this. Well, how that affects the news is this. Something happens, a train crash or some rape or something, and it gets on the internet because of the cell phones. that number one is a dramatically more credible new news source for ordinary people. Number two, though, and this is really important, it puts pressure on the state media to do better. Both in speed, because the cell phones are quick, so we can't lag 3 days behind before we tell about the train crash, right? And in credibility, because if our story is a bunch of officialese junk and the cell phones are with pictures saying what happened, people are going to believe this, not that. So it puts pressure on the state media also to be more realistic and credible in what they report. He has an essay in here called The Significance of the Wong'an Incident. This is an incident in, is it Guangxi or Guizhou anyway, a southwestern province where a young woman is raped by 3 young men who are well connected to party leaders locally, and she's killed then and her body's thrown in the river. And this is discovered, and the police do their investigation, and they find that nothing really happened here, and these are fine young men, and we don't quite know why her body's in the river and stuff. But people with cell phones and internet access knew and put it on the web. And then there's this juxtaposition of a fake story and a real story. And the crucial point that Liu Xiaobo makes is really very astute. He said, instantly, all over the internet, people look at that and 100% just about sympathize with this story and disbelieve that one. And he asks, why is that? Is that because all these other people knew the victim and the victim's family? Or they knew the other people and hated them? No, because it's all over the country. Everybody reflexively sides with the persecuted, the underdog, the victim, against these power holders who are doing these things. And that shows, Liu Xiaobo argues, that these people elsewhere already have that kind of experience. So they don't have to be told where the right and wrong is. They say, oh yeah, that's like what happened to me, or that's what happened to Lao Zhang down the street. And this is what I mean by Liu Xiaobo's brain. Anybody can describe what I just did and tell you about this story, but the way he can see an insight and show why this tells us about popular thought much more broadly than just what happened in Wong'an is impressive. Another essay on the internet he calls Imprisoning People for Their Words, where he starts just with 6 cases that he puts up describing how people have put on the internet injustices that have happened in their local contexts, and showing sometimes how the ability to put it up there actually forces the official to apologize or sometimes even make reparations. Now you might ask, why would the official fear public criticism on the internet? It's not that the official fears that. The official fears his superior, or hers, usually his, because if it looks bad in your town, if the corruption is open, then the provincial level official doesn't like you, so that's where the pressure comes from. But be that as it may, it works. So this local publicizing of injustices has an effect that wasn't possible before the internet. And typical of Liu Xiaobo, he goes on to make another very astute point about this. He says, all of this happens inside China. We don't need Human Rights Watch in New York, Amnesty International, to tell us about that. Sometimes good-hearted people on the outside in human rights work bemoan the fact that there's a great firewall, and Human Rights Watch's website is blocked. It is. The New York Times is blocked half the time because there's this big cyber firewall that keeps outside opinions coming in. Liu Xiaobo says, that's right. That is regrettable. It would be much better if Chinese people had access to the internet worldwide. But don't think that that sinks the boat, because all 6 of these cases happen not because they've heard of some famous dissident like me, not because they've heard of Human Rights Watch's opinions. They have their own moral values. They see that the moral values were violated, and that's all they need. The facts and their values on the ground. So that's what that essay says about the internet. I'll just comment on 2 or 3 others that he does. He has one on humor. From wicked satire to gao. Who here in Chinese knows enough Chinese? Gao means it's very hard to translate. It's to mess around with something in order to make it look ugly or weird. It's sort of like satire, but it's a much broader term than that. And he writes about gao on the internet that makes fun of corruption and violence and the mucky-mucks on top and all of this. But then he does a very interesting intellectual thing. This, again, is typical of his intellect. His intellect. He says a lot of intellectuals say that cracking political jokes is counterproductive. Because what does it do? It lets us let off steam in an innocuous way. And he gives anecdotes about his own friends who will sit around a banquet table and exchange really nasty jokes about top leaders and corruption and all of this. But once the steam's blown off, turn around the next day, go to work, be part of the machine and keep the wheels turning. And some people argue that that means that the jokes are counterproductive. They let off steam in an innocuous way. He gives that argument its full credence, but then says, I still think the political jokes do more good than harm. And he goes on to explain why. He says, how far does corruption reach in our society? It reaches everywhere, into every nook and cranny, major, small, rural, urban. How far do political jokes about corruption reach? Co-equal. They reach just as far. A brave dissident like him standing up in a city or trying to write something in a New York magazine that might or might not get into China can't reach there. So he says the political jokes prepare the ground for change everywhere, even though we have to wait for some kind of spark plug or something to happen in order for it to come around. He makes a comparison to Václav Havel and Milan Kundera in Czechoslovakia. It's a breadth of reading comes out all of a sudden as well. Havel, as you know, writes these trenchant essays about human rights and living in truth and the power of the powerless. He's sort of, they stand on the soapbox and pronounce the principles from the top down kind of dissident. Kundera's first book is called The Joke, which tells about political jokes and the jokes spread. And he doesn't get up there on a soapbox and pronounce principles. He just has these jokes. And so Liu Xiaobo stands back and says, okay, now what was more important for Czechoslovakia? Havel or Kundera? And his answer is, both. Why not? But certainly this joking helps to prepare the ground. Near the end of his essay, he writes this: in China, political jokes have already been making it clear for some time now that the legitimacy of the dictatorship is not sustainable. This means that an end, when it comes, will not be so much of a shock. People will be able to take it more easily in stride, and this will have the benefit of reducing anxieties and lessening the likelihood that people will seek violent revenge. Right here you see his pacifism. He's even thinking that the political jokes will be good for the oppressors because it means when it comes their turn to answer the bell, they'll be treated a little softer. You were a joke to start with, you're still a joke, and go away. Because jokes, I'm continuing with his direct quote here, because jokes had been letting them blow off some of their anger all along, they will have less accumulated anger to deal with. And in addition to all of that, the positive values that have underlain political jokes, and then in parentheses, satire of what is wrong always implies that something else is right, will be available for use after the transition. In a post-totalitarian dictatorship, the grins of the people are the nightmares of the dictators. One other essay, the longest in the book, you'll be happy to know, is about sex. It's called The Erotic Carnival in Recent Chinese History, where he, first of all, he just sketches for you how, in the Mao era, the lovers in the, you can't even call them lovers, the male and female, handsome and beautiful lead in the model opera is what it most, that was the extent of, public, anyway, sexual interchange. And then through the 70s, 80s, 90s, it gets more and more just open and voluptuous. He has an anecdote near the end about a banquet that he observed where a nude female body is laid out on the table, and the dishes are literally brought on her body and eaten from that. I mean, how extreme can you get there? But then he analyzes this rise in the visibility of sex in Chinese public life as, first of all, corruption, because a lot of the sex work and so on is done as a way of paying off business deals and stuff. The number of prostitutes in China, he points out, is by far the largest of any country in the world. So corruption is one. Diversion from politics. He claims and shows in some examples how this obsession with sex and this pursuit of sex draws people's attention and energies away from other irritations in their life that might lead to more political action. And then third, a kind of misogyny in disguise. And here again, you have to admire his intellect. He digs, and finds another important level. For example, what he means by misogyny in disguise is he tells the story of a woman named Zhao Wei, a woman broadcaster on Central Chinese TV who's very good-looking, as women broadcasters in most places are selected to be and stuff. And one day, in her job, she wears a piece of clothing that has a red spot in the middle of a white field that someone on the internet sees, or on television maybe, and says, that's the Japanese flag in disguise. And then all of this angry youth, usually young, male, super nationalist youth, start to attack her, saying things like, let her move to Japan if she wants to be a whore, or if Japanese can do her, why can't we? Really disgusting things. And then he points out that what that is doing is letting these angry young nationalist men fantasize about violent sex with a beautiful celebrity, while at the same time saying it's patriotism, it's nationalism, we're anti-Japanese. Exemplifying what you might call male chauvinism in two senses. We're running out of time, aren't we?
Battery pack on?
This one?
Yeah, this one seems to have lost the battery.
This one lost, okay. How's that? He has one about the rise of China as a great power. I'm not going to read that because we're running short on time, but it's got to do with the rise of China on the international scene and more or less a plea to the rest of the world to watch this. The Communist Party, again, is leading China down a disastrously mistaken historical road, and the rest of the world's naive if you don't look squarely at what's happening. I do want to go, though, and maybe these will be my last examples, too. There's so many, there's 3 or 4 more. On Tibet, he has an essay called So Long as Chinese have no freedom, Tibet will have no autonomy, in which his main point is that the Tibet problem is not an ethnic problem, because the problems of repression in Tibet are the problems of repression inside China. Tibetan Buddhism is repressed, but unauthorized religion inside China is also repressed. The leader of the Tibetan movement, the Dalai Lama, is exiled. But the leader of the Falun Gong movement is also exiled. Other political dissidents are exiled. So it's a pretty eloquent argument about that. I'm not going to go into more detail. Another one about Tibet, though, I love. It's Obama's election and a proposal for China, which he wrote the day after Barack Obama was elected the first time in 2008. He says he's so impressed at the symbolic value of a minority leading a great democracy. And then says if the Chinese were really wise, the Chinese leaders were really wise, they would, I quote, they could invite the Dalai Lama back to China to serve as our nation's president, our Barack Obama. Such a move would make the best use of the Dalai Lama's stature in Tibet and all around the world. Now, a couple of you chuckled, and of course that's a crackpot idea that Chinese leadership would never do that. But as an intellectual illustration of his point, I think it's brilliant. You know, a minority can be the president in this strongest democracy in the world. You know, we can at least suggest this and just show the distance between where we are and where we ought to be. He has an essay on the gold medal syndrome, where he shows how the passion for winning gold medals in the Olympics not only diverts resources from ordinary parks and athletic equipment for ordinary Chinese people, but really the heart of the essay is the regimen through which the Olympic athletes are put, not being able to see their families for 2 years and diving in water before they're 6 years old and their retinas are damaged and stuff. He has a brilliant essay on Confucius, arguing that Confucius, compared with other Chinese ancient thinkers like Zhuangzi, Mengzi, Hanfeizi, and Mozi, showed a mediocre intellect and only meager talent for human empathy. One of the famous phrases that's attributed to Confucian thought is, when the going gets tough, the scholar retreats and waits for the time to go back and help society. He jumps on that and has this paragraph. How costly has it been for Chinese people that this particular thinker, this most sly, most smooth, most utilitarian, most worldly wise Confucius, who shied away from public responsibility and showed no empathy for people who suffer, became their sage and exemplar for 2,000 years. He does show how Mengzi and Hanfeizi and others were more empathetic to poor people and suffering people and more willing to stand out and put their own necks on the line and so on. Okay. I have several more things that I could, but I'm going to stop here. I've gone on for about an hour. Why don't we stop and have you ask questions or throw paper airplanes or whatever you feel like doing. Yeah.
I wanted you to keep talking about Confucius, about the last thing you were talking about, his feelings on Confucius.
Oh. You can go buy the book, or if you don't want to, I'll send you by email that essay, with no charge. I don't know how to say more about it.
Well, it just seemed like you were cutting it so short.
No, I was cutting short what I was going to say about other essays.
That's all right.
He starts by tracing how Confucius was, of course, an itinerant advisor of kings, but shows how he was cagey and tactical and so on, compared to Mencius, for example, or Hanfeizi, who were more principled in their stance. It was an eye-opener to me. I always sort of more or less accepted that Confucius was the founding, stake in the ground thinker for ancient Chinese thought, but I don't think so anymore. I don't think he's right.
So are his works widely known in China? Because I was reading on Wikipedia,
Yeah.
which is not search accurate or whatever, but he's compared to Aung San Suu Kyi from Burma. So I was trying to see if he was kind of seen at that same level by people living in China.
No. Aung San Suu Kyi is much better known in Burma than he is in China. Because ever since he came out of prison in 1991. His work had been banned inside China, so the only way Chinese people know about him is when it's published outside and it leaks back in. And among intellectuals, he has a very strong following, and it's nationwide, but it's not very far down the society. What I like to point out about this, though, is that the fact that the government bans him is the most eloquent possible evidence that they know he would be popular if they didn't ban him, right? If what they say about him, that he's un-Chinese and that he's, un-Chinese, he doesn't fit into our society and our culture. That's what they say about his ideas. If they themselves really believed that was true, they'd allow the works to be publicly available, right? Here's what he says, go laugh at it, but they know that wouldn't happen. So no, he isn't, unfortunately, at a popular level, he isn't that well known. And I should add this, insofar as just the casual person might have heard of him, they have a negative impression because the government, what they do say about him is distorted. I'll give you an example. One of the things you can probably find on the internet that the government and government defenders say about him is that he favors colonialism for China. He thinks China should be colonized for 300 or 400 years. I don't know if anybody's seen that comment that pops up. You've seen it? Right, okay, so that comes straight from the propaganda department in Beijing. They want that to be the tag, how he's known. But let me tell you how that comment came out. It came out in November or December of 1988, when he had been in Singapore and he was headed for Oslo, and I told you about his trip to Europe. He stopped in Hong Kong, and he had an interview with a man named Jin Zhong, who runs a magazine called the Open Magazine, Kaifang. And they were talking, Jin Zhong asked him, what's your impression of Hong Kong? Oh, I like it. People here are friendly, and they get in line, and they treat each other well on the street. And Jin Zhong says, well, don't do that back in China. And he says, no, not nearly as well. They're civilized people here in Hong Kong. I like this. And then Jin Zhong, the editor, said, well, that's partly because of Hong Kong's colonial past. And people, learn to get in line and stuff like this. It was Jin Zhong who said it, not Liu Xiaobo. Then Liu Xiaobo makes a wisecrack. And he said, well, how long was Hong Kong colonized? Well, 150 years. It'll take 300 years in China. He threw it off. It's a joke, and he threw it off that way, right? Okay, so the party grabs that tiny little wisp of truth and then spreads the message that Liu Xiaobo is in favor of 300 years of colonization of China. But if you read the essay here that I told you about briefly, about his going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and his disillusion with the West doesn't have the answers. He wrote this book that's called, what we have here is the afterword to the book. Let me tell you exactly what the name of the book is. Where is it here? He published in Taiwan, a book called Chinese Politics and China's Modern Intellectuals. It's not been translated, published in Taiwan in the late 80s, where he argues that that China has to use the West as the yardstick to catch up with. And then when he writes this afterward, he says, this whole book is wrong. The West can't be the yardstick because the West has too many of its own problems. And that's when it falls to me and to every human being to figure out the answer, and I feel incomplete as a human being. That's the real Liu Xiaobo. But what the party says he is in favor of 300 years of colonization, which is ridiculous. So most people, I'm afraid, in China who know about it, know that level only. Yeah?
With the recent protests in Hong Kong, is anyone kind of using a recent protest with some of his writings or with anything related to him?
That's a good question. I want to say yes, but I don't know the details. I mean, it cannot be that nobody has thought of him in his writings. in Hong Kong. Certainly the whole protest in Hong Kong on both sides, the government side and the student side, conjures the memory of Tiananmen 25 years earlier. And he was right in the middle of that situation. So there have to have been parallels. The government, of course, and by the government I mean Beijing here. Let's not pretend that the Hong Kong government is autonomous from Beijing. That's not true. They take their cues directly from Beijing. They are embarrassed, rightly of course, about the history of the massacre. And that's their least favorite way to solve the Hong Kong problem. And I still think it's unlikely that it'll come to that. On the students' side, they remember Tiananmen, and in the back of their minds is the possibility of violence, much more vividly than the students 25 years ago in Beijing. I was in Beijing at the time of the massacre and talked to students and saw the whole thing. They were naive on that score. So was I. Nobody thought that there would really be tanks and machine guns shooting at unarmed students. But it happened. And that memory is in the students' minds in Hong Kong, too. So they know that if push comes to shove, they better retreat before the shove comes. And they already sort of have. But retreating, I think, in Hong Kong doesn't mean giving up. It's more like the Liu Xiaobo tactic of when you're pushed back, okay, you retreat, and then you go back when you can. But if it really did come to push, come to shove, I think they would use violence again. That remains credible. It's unlikely, but that's what would happen if there were no other way to put down the demonstration.
I completely understand the concept, the idea that reform, the pressure for reform comes from the bottom up.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily government officials per se.
Right.
But to be fair, what certain government officials themselves
Yeah.
the victim of this? For example,
Government officials themselves.
during the Cultural Revolution,
Yeah.
like Deng Xiaoping,
Yeah.
he kind of suffered.
Yeah. Sure.
Because he, when now is a Deng, when he encouraged it, Deng Xiaoping was a pragmatist.
Was it what?
Pragmatist.
Pragmatist.
And he was still on the side of the government.
Yeah.
He wanted, he was more the pragmatic in terms of moderation.
Yeah.
And he got punished for that.
Right.
So on one hand, yes, it is from the bottom up, but on the other hand,
Yeah.
people such as Deng did.
Right.
Hit.
Right.
So how do you reconcile?
Well, I like that question. I want to broaden it a little more. The question was people inside the system, even power holders inside the system, like Deng Xiaoping, also suffered under the Cultural Revolution in Mao and were pragmatists and learned how to come back later. So how does that square with my thesis and Liu Xiaobo's thesis that the change is from the bottom up? That's a really good question because he argues, and I would argue too, that the division between who's on top and who's below is partly a psychological division. That is, even in the minds of the power holders, the minds of everybody, there are layers. That is, let's take the ordinary person. I know I'm not supposed to go out on the street and say, down with the Communist Party, but down underneath here, I might be willing to accept it if it happened, or to put it another way, what if the party came along and said, this wouldn't happen, this is a thought experiment, right? Came out and said, we're done with this kind of one-party dictatorship. We're going to start a democratic system tomorrow. How many people would stand up and say, no, 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 your one-party system has served us well for 65 years. Keep it in place. They wouldn't. But how many people accept the one-party system day to day? Almost everybody. This shows the psychological difference between what one does and what one feels inside, and it applies to leaders too. There, your question is right, including pretty high leaders. Let me tell you an anecdote that happened to me when I was at Princeton about this. I was already on a blacklist and well known as a critic of the party, and a group came through led by the chair of the Politburo of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Congress, which is a kind of a populist rubber stamp kind of thing. It's not a really powerful group, but it's nationwide and it's huge, and this was the Politburo people, and they were coming on a tour. They came to Princeton. They brought with them some diplomats from the Chinese consulate in New York. They came to Princeton, and they asked to see me. I didn't ask to see them. They said, we want to meet Perry Link. And so I went, and I brought one of my students, one of my language students, just for fun. And there were about 10 people, 12 maybe, sitting around this table, and me and my student. And the head of the delegation started off, Professor Link, we've noticed that you have certain biases. And I said, oh, well, what biases? And then issues started coming out. And I talked in Chinese to them about corruption, about environment, about violence, about all of these things. One by one, issues. And they didn't say much. All 12 of them sort of waited until the head of the delegation sort of said, well, no, you still have your biases. And that was that. But the point of the anecdote is, as soon as that meeting was over, 2 or 3 of them came to me later and said, how's Liu Binyan doing? Liu Binyan was the big dissident journalist who was there in residence in Beijing, and he and I were friends, and they wanted to know about it. And some of them came to me and said, if your student here wants to come to China, we'll help. You know. So here again was the bifurcation of language. The official language up here and the informal language down here. The informal language reflecting what's inside their minds better. And yet, during the official meeting, they wouldn't say anything against their leader. Why? Because all the rest of them are listening. You know, if you say the wrong thing to this firebrand American in a meeting, and it's reported back in Beijing that you said, how's Liu Binyan, or your student is welcome. Can't do that, but privately you say it. Another really funny anecdote that shows the same point. This happened at Princeton too, and I'd been an editor of a book called the Tiananmen Papers, which was a compilation of documents about the massacre and the whole lead up to the massacre that was smuggled out by an official in the late 1990s, and Andy Nathan at Columbia, a political scientist and I translated and edited it and went out. So it was a super radioactive book. Right? A few years later, 2 officials come from China, from the Ministry of Education and from the Hanban, the group that does the Confucius Institutes, and wants to talk to us about language teaching and language exchange. And we go to an elegant luncheon in the faculty club and talk to them about students and student exchange and education. And afterwards they say, can we continue talking in your office, my office? So we do. And the 3 of us are there in my office talking more about student exchange and this and that. One of them has to urinate. He asks, where's the men's room? We're down the hall. He gets up and goes down. As soon as he leaves the room, the other one says, do you have the Tiananmen Papers? Can you give it to me? It was on my shelf. I took it down. I'll sign it for you. No, don't sign it. Put it in an envelope, a manila envelope, before the other guy comes back, obviously. Right? And I did. I put it in an envelope, and it was in the envelope by the time the other one came back. So there, 2 levels in the high official But there's two levels in his thinking. That sort of responds to what your question was, I think. Does it?
Yeah.
It's a very good question. Any other questions? More questions? Yeah.
Yeah, earlier you said he became disillusioned with the West,
Yeah.
and seeing everything, but isn't there something still to learn from, like, in regards to the government structure and civil liberties? Especially when you mention the internet and everything like
Right.
that. I mean, isn't there still something to take away from the West?
Oh, yeah, right. I should have been clearer there. He's very clear on exactly that point right in the middle of the essay. He says, I used to think the West was our yardstick. Now I have two separate important tasks. One is to continue measuring China's deficiencies by international standards. Task number two, to question the international standards themselves, and as a thinking human being, to do my own critique of them. So he's doing both. He didn't shuck the other one, no, but added the second one.
I take it the Met was robbery or something. Why the Metropolitan? Why did he have this epiphany that the West is bad at the Metro? You said that twice.
No, that's a miscommunication on my part, too. The West was bad was more from seeing commercialism in our society and realizing environmental pollution and the nuclear threats and that kind of thing made him disillusioned with the West. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I don't think he tells us exactly which artworks it was, they made him have that transcendent feeling, that the individual human being is incomplete and needs a transcendent connection. And then he writes about Liu Xun, the famous early 20th century Chinese writer, who's, in many people's views, including mine, is probably the best 20th century writer, mostly of short stories, mostly very insightful, acerbic social criticism, but doesn't confront that transcendent idea. He gives an example of one of Liu Xun's essays that comes closest to it is called Guo Ke, the passerby, where a passerby in a mountain trail comes and he stops at a hut where there's an old man and a young girl, and they give him water, and they ask him, where are you from? He says, I'm not quite sure. What's your name? I'm not quite sure. Well, where are you headed? That way. Well, what's up there? Graveyard. That's all. So it makes you think about things, but even Liu Xun getting that close to it, a kind of religious question, doesn't, according to Liu Xiaobo, he doesn't ask, what happens after death, or how complete is a human being in this world. And he's basically right. 20th century Chinese writers, they're brilliant in some ways, but they don't ask that kind of Metropolitan Museum. And I don't know which art it was, but maybe, angels in the firmament or something made him, and it wasn't just one piece of art. It was his visit that made him realize there's something human beings ought to strive for that goes beyond this worldly things. So that wasn't disillusioning to him. The Metropolitan Museum of Art opened his mind and pushed him in a positive direction. Dodgers. How come the Dodgers did so bad? Yeah.
What's going to happen when he gets released? Is he going to stay in the general population? Is he going to leave?
That's a good question. It's like asking, what is the state of Chinese politics going to be in the year 2020?
Because I can imagine if he would get caught again, what would happen? Would they double his sentence? Would he just, like, writing?
I feel confident in this. He will be himself when he comes out, unless they somehow torture him into a state where he's lost his mind, which isn't beyond conception. But if he's the same person, he won't behave any differently. So your question amounts to asking, what will the context be like? in 2020, not what will he be like. Who knows what China in 2020 will be like? It's even conceivable that China will have a much more open, liberal political system by then. We don't know. It might be much worse. It might be even more authoritarian than it is now. We don't know. But he won't change. I mean, he's already shown that. But, you know, when his sentence was handed down, that was on Christmas Day in 2009. I think calculated to be on Christmas Day, partly so that the Western media wouldn't be paying that close attention to it. But anyway, 11 years in prison on Christmas Day 2009. Then he, in the legal system, and of course the legal system is there, and the government has to pretend that it's a real legal system, so there has to be an opportunity to appeal if you want, and he appeals. And some of his critics said, that's stupid. That system will never change its mind. Your appeal is a waste of time. To which his response was, I know it's futile. I'm not appealing because I think there's any chance of the sentence being overturned or changed. I'm doing it so that the record of what happens to an independent intellectual when he confronts an authoritarian government is a complete record right down to the end. So I'm going to appeal and have that part of the record too. The very last document in this book is out of tune with all the rest of the book from a literary point of view. It's the official court's decision on it. And you can read it. I mean, it's repetitive, verbose, bureaucratic stuff that goes around and around. I mean, Václav Havel argues this very well in his essay, The Power of the Powerless. Why do dissidents pretend that a legal system that they know is not a real legal system and that is stacked against them, why do they appeal to it at all? And Havel's answer is sort of like Liu Xiaobo's, because it shows the difference between the real world and the pretense world. It shows that the pretense world is a pretense. In Havel's words, it attacks the mendacious system at its point of maximum mendacity. That's sort of what Liu Xiaobo is doing.
Could you tell us a little bit about Charter 08 for those students who don't know much about it, but then also for anyone, where it's been since 08, what its fate is, and if anybody is touting it today?
Charter 08 is in the book. This happened in 08. It didn't start with Liu Xiaobo. It started with Zhang Zuhua and Wen Kejian and some other of his sort of friends. He stood apart from it originally because he thought, this isn't verbatim from him, this is my take on why. He thought it was futile, that it's not going to get anywhere. Then when it started to get places, other intellectuals wrote parts of it, and it got some, just in intellectual circles, dissident intellectual circles, it's got quite a bit of momentum. Near the end of the process, he came in and said, okay, I will support it. And he did two things to support it. One was to help spread it. He did more than anybody else to go around and solicit signatures. And when it was announced in December 10th, 2008, it had 303 signatures, many of which he had personally solicited. The other thing, though, he did that was politically courageous was say, I will take the rap. I will put my name as the one who's responsible for this, knowing that it could risk prison. I don't know if he was also thinking it might lead to a Nobel Prize, probably not, but he said, okay, you can blame it on me, and did. I saw it first in late October 2008, because I was friends with Zhang Zuhua and those others, and they sent it to me, right here, UC Riverside, my computer, they sent this thing to me, Charter 08, will you translate it for us? And this is embarrassing for me to admit, but I didn't even read it very carefully. It's long. It's all about elections and democracy and human rights and constitutionalism and this and that, but it's also got paragraphs on education and the environment and military subservience to a civilian authority. It's very broad-ranging, very rational, and very mild, actually. There's nothing terribly incendiary in there. What really got the government that was in there was the one-party rule thing. It said we need an end to one-party rule, and they can't swallow that. Anyway, back to my story. It came in late October, and I didn't do anything, and about 3 weeks later, they emailed me again, are you going to do this or not? Because if you're not, we'll find somebody else. And then I read it, and this is cool, and started translating it. And then Liu Xiaobo got it, and started making changes right up to close to the end. He was telephoning my wife and me here at Riverside saying, change this, change that. And we did at first, but then I finally stopped. I said, no more changes. Not because I was tired of translating, but I was worried that he was making changes after those other 300 or so had signed, and I didn't know if he'd checked with all of them and stuff. So I stopped making changes, and if you compare my official translation, which the New York Review of Books published right on the spot, they said, we'll put this on the web right now. It's a little different here and there from the one that came out at the same time in Chinese because of some of his last-minute changes. Some of the controversial things were whether to name Falun Gong, for example, whether that should be by name in there as a repressed group. Some thought yes, some thought no. Can't remember what some of the other debates at the last moment were. But then it was officially criticized about 6 weeks later and suppressed on the internet as a lasting, I think its lasting effect, of course it had to do with his getting the Nobel Prize. It probably was the most important document in the case that was made for him to get the Nobel Prize. Desmond Tutu recommended him, Václav Havel recommended him, some really heavy hitters internationally recommended him, and he got the prize. But since then, I'm not sure Charter 08 itself has had much of an afterlife. It's sort of been superseded by this citizens movement, Xi Zhong's movement, has taken some of the limelight since then and stuff. But it's still there. And eventually, you see, if there is a turnover someday in China, and suddenly this society that has not been able to organize, because any organization is crushed, it's completely disparate, but knows kind of intellectually or intuitively that we want democracy, and we want human rights, and we want a constitution. Where are they going to turn? Well, they might well turn substantially to Charter 08, if and when that happens.
It brings up the difference between what happened in Eastern Europe, because the Charter 77 movement, Havel attributed a great deal to, as when the Pfau came, that the civil society had been kind of legitimized from these people who had not been demoralized. They had stood up even though there was no sense to standing up in that situation. But then they could come and take power, like you're saying, could have happened with the Charter 8 movement. But I was struck by that essay you wrote is that unlike Eastern Europe, where it was similar to the situation you're talking about, nobody believes, right? It's post-totalitarian. The system works, and everybody's compromised, and everybody's bought in on one level or another by getting along, right? You're either more compromised or less compromised. These kind of issues that Havel talked about, but nobody believes in the ideology. When I was in China, I kind of felt that when I was there. It was a few years ago. But the difference being that economically, they've been given the liberty and the freedom, and everybody thought, okay, now that'll ultimately breed democracy, because once you have desire, choice when it comes to goods, you want and automatically want choices in the rest of your life. But is it peculiar to China that that doesn't seem to be enough force? Or, I mean, you want to make that stereotypical kind of thing, the lack of individualism or the deference to social norms that's more of the Confucian tradition. I'm a European historian, so you could see it. That tap was never released in Eastern Europe. They never had the right to choose economically. This is the black market, right? Impoverished. But here the tap's been released, and it's never switched. You see what I'm trying to say? Maybe from where you sit, what does it look like to you?
Well, that's a good question, a tough question. First of all, I'd say the jury's still out on whether economic growth and the growth of the middle class is going to bring an end to the dictatorship. So far, it hasn't happened. I remember in the 90s when Bill Clinton and Tony Blair and others were saying, well, engage with China, deal with China, stop making human rights demands on the government because of this theory that a rising middle class will bring liberalization. And so far, you're quite right, it hasn't happened in China. The reason so far it hasn't happened is that, number one, most of the moneyed elite is the Communist Party and their people. Because if you're the party and you can control the resources, then you're the ones who can set up factories and buy real estate and manipulate. And that's why I was saying before how all the top leaders, and it's not just the top leaders, the elite generally, about 10% of the population, top level and at provincial levels and down a little farther, are wealthy because they're connected to political power. Now, you do have some homegrown capitalists who, from brains and personality, do well. What the party has done with them is co-opt them. Yes, welcome you into the party. Jiang Zemin, who was 2 sessions ago the Communist Party secretary, the top leader, actually added to Mao Zedong thought Deng Xiaoping theory and Jiang Zemin's 3 represents. One of the represents was we represent capitalism. Gentle way of saying we're co-opting the people that have done well. So far, the connection between political power and money and accumulation of money has stuck. So that the elite that has the money identifies with the political authority and doesn't challenge it. So that's my reading as of now, but I started my answer by saying I'm not ready to say that eventually that theory that more money means more demand for choice and could lead to a disaggregation of the elite. It still could happen. Right now, with this anti-corruption campaign that we see, that at a popular level is very, very popular, that people love to see these corrupt officials taken to task. What the ordinary people don't see too clearly, or maybe they do, but they don't care about it because at least something good is happening. What they don't see is that it's the political opponents of the ones who really have more power that are getting whacked by the anti-corruption campaign. So it's still a political process. It's not opposing all corruption. If all corruption were dismantled in China, the regime would collapse. There's no question it would collapse. The regime lives off this money that it has, and special access to the money.
Just to follow up on that, though, as you pointed out, the reading of Maoism as the kind of indigenous Chinese quality in going back into Chinese history. I mean, can you carry that idea forward and say, is this a continuation of those same trends where the people, these populist movements, is it not a deference issue that's going on there? That's what I'm trying to think about.
No, I think you're right about that. I think you're right about that. I do. And I think that the reason that money bringing liberalization has happened slower in China than it would have in Europe, if Europe had Eastern Europe had an economic boom. I think that's right. I think there's something cultural there. Saying that there's something cultural there, though, always makes me feel guilty because culture is such a broad explanatory factor. I mean, you can give up and say anything's culture. But your point, I agree with it. I think you're right. There's something at least a little bit different about China from Europe in that regard. Others?
One more question?
You mentioned that people are interpreting Deng Xiaoping to be more as acting based on what the public wants. Yet Tiananmen Square happened, and a lot of the public was outraged about that.
Yeah.
What would you interpret like his action of Tiananmen to be more like asserting his authority, or?
Yeah. What I meant to say was that China's reform, more economic liberalization, more personal freedoms at a daily life level, more exchange with the rest of the world, all of that's what is meant by reform, isn't so much his idealism. This is what I want for the Chinese people, and Mao got it wrong, so I'm going to be nice to them and give it right. I prefer to view it, in fact, it's much better viewed as his trying to preserve the power of the party in the face of popular demands for all of this, which had really built up to an explosive point by the end of Mao's life. I lived in China just 2 years after Mao died for a whole year. And students were just so bright-eyed and wondering about everything in the West. And you have refrigerators in your room, and you have things that are ABCs to us, and they just assume that everything in the West was, of course, much better than what we have in China, and we have to burst out, and we've been held back in this bottle for 15 years, that kind of mentality. So that kind of push from below, and as I sort of outlined, it started with farmers and then intellectuals and students and various groups from below push. At Tiananmen, that was students pushing, although there was a lot more than students there. The students were the ones on the streets, but the mentality of the city supporting them couldn't have been clearer. And I rode my bicycle around Beijing during those days, and people were different during those days when the students were in charge. I saw a bike accident once. 2 bikes crashed into each other and fell to the ground. Now, normally, if you've been to China or been anywhere, I suppose, what happens when 2 bikes crash is that you hear every cuss word in the world back and forth, you know, you're blind and this and that. No, at this accident, he stood up and biked. Are you okay? I'm like, sorry. I'm exaggerating a bit, but not much. And other people have noticed this too. There was a definite softening of public intercourse during those days. So, am I straying from your question, though? What Deng Xiaoping did in ordering the massacre was in that same pattern of what do I have to do in order to keep the lid on society. It wasn't just Beijing at the time. About 30 other major cities, mostly provincial capitals, had pretty big demonstrations. Students were out there. So, he's got to clear the square. He could have used water hoses. He could have used tear gas. He could have used billy clubs. 3 years earlier, when Zhou Enlai was memorialized at Tiananmen Square, there was another Tiananmen movement that was cleared by force using billy clubs. Nobody was killed during the clearing. Some were shot later for having done it at all, but that's different. My point is, he could have cleared the square without deaths, but chose tanks and machine guns. Deng Xiaoping's not dumb. Why did he do that? Because he wanted it clear, not only in Beijing, but all those other cities, just stop! And not only through space, but through time. There was a rumor that leaked out at the time that his son, Deng Pufang, who was paraplegic and stuff, had said that his father said, I am trading perhaps 1,000 lives for 20 years of stability. 牺牲1000人换取20年, something like that. Now, I don't know if that's a true rumor or not, but that theory of why he was doing it worked not only in shutting up all of China, but keeping China shut up for now 25 years. Because even now, people know there's that line. There's a certain line you don't cross, or else. And the massacre did that. No question in my mind that that was a political tactic to use lethal force instead of billy clubs or tear gas.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.